Well, hello there you gorgeous lot, and welcome to another episode of Fuds and Film. I'm Drew Avondale, with me this evening Mr. Scott Morris.
That's me.
Now, in this episode, we are going to be covering journalism and journalists as portrayed in film. I could say that we picked this topic because it's timely, but really, when is this topic not timely? But in reality, it was picked simply because it seemed interesting to us. That said, it is timely in our current age of fake news. Not the fake news that dangerously incompetent narcissists decry when the word they are looking for is in fact inconvenient, but the genuine fake news, the sort that helped said mendacious arse trumpet get elected. The kind of false news that at best misleads, and at worst causes division, violence and harm to the vulnerable. Perhaps more worrying is the decline in the general standards of both writing and investigative journalism. It still exists, of course, though it seems much more difficult to come by. Fortunately, we can always turn to celluloid when we want to remember, or perhaps delude ourselves, that an individual journalist or an organisation can make a genuine difference to a person's life, an industry, or a country, as cinema has a long-standing love of the profession and those around it. From the corrupted by power Charles Foster Kane and the vilified by the press Jefferson Smith, to the meticulously researched and explosive collective efforts of the Boston Globe Spotlight team. There were a huge number of films that featured either journalism or journalists that we could have selected for this episode, and some we reluctantly had to leave out, including films we highly recommend, such as the Hitchcock thriller Foreign Correspondent, Federico Fellini's magnificent La Dolce Vita, and Costa Gavras' Z, but we tried to provide a selection that included some highly regarded and popular films, as well as some that we hadn't seen before, including some lesser known pieces, and tried to cover a range of topics, eras and countries. To that end, in this episode we will explore the story of a journalist whose mild curiosity about a classified ad turns into a crusade to free an innocent man, a young man who decided that making it all up was a better way of doing things than actual work, two political reporters who stumble upon one of the biggest scoops of the 20th century and produce some of the most influential and famous reportage in history, a reserved older writer whose conscience is stirred by the passionate youth around him, a principled television producer fighting against corporate self-interest to get his story broadcast, and a journalist poet who gets caught between two opposing but equally corrupt politicians. So we hope that there'll be something in this lot that you'll find to take your fancy.
Unless you don't like journalism, in which case you're SOL.
So, let's get straight into things then, with a film from the United States from 1948. Now, the theme of this podcast means that we are expending an extended amount of time in the murky waters of based on a true story, a cinematic statement that at times I feel ought to carry the same weight and feeling as Here Be Dragons on ancient maps. Henry Hathaway's 1948 noirish drama Call Northside 777 is another of these, purporting to tell the true tale of a journalist's investigation and campaign to exonerate two men he believes were wrongly imprisoned. The story begins in Prohibition-era Chicago, a pretty damn lawless time, when a police officer is shot and killed in a speakeasy. Two men, Frank Wiecek, played by Richard Conte, and Tomek Zaleska, played by George Tyne, are convicted by the eyewitness evidence of the speakeasy's owner Wanda Skutnik, Betty Gard, and sentenced to life in prison. 11 years later, Chicago Times reporter P.J. McNeil, James Stewart, is tasked by his editor Brian Kelly, Lee J. Cobb, to look into an intriguing classified ad, which offers a $5,000 reward for information relating to the Wiecek case, asking anyone with such information to call Northside 777. This leads him to Tilly Wiecek, Kasia Orsazewski, Frank Wiecek's mother, who he encounters scrubbing floors. She is convinced of her son's innocence, and is offered the reward in the hopes of clearing his name. The sceptical McNeil discovers that she has raised the money by scrubbing floors for a decade, and saving every penny, nickel and dime that she can. When cautioned by the reporter that she is likely to only attract crazies and money seekers, she is unconcerned, and tells them if it's unsuccessful she will scrub for another 10 years and offer $10,000 if necessary, if it will help her boy. Moved by Tilly's faith and dedication, but otherwise believing it unworthy of further pursuit, McNeil intends to write up a minor human interest piece and go on with his life. His editor, Kelly, has other plans though, and urges him to follow it up. This includes a trip to the state penitentiary to interview Vicek and to talk to Zaleska, meetings with Vicek's ex-wife, and trips through newspaper and police archives of the time. During this, the Times publishes the story, and Vicek's plight captures the public's imagination. The sceptical McNeil gradually becomes convinced of Vicek and Zaleska's innocence, and begins a crusade to clear their name, or at least to get a retrial. This draws the ire of the state, not because of such petty considerations as wrongful imprisonment, of course, but because it will reflect badly on the governor. And it was a different party in power then, but they will be blamed, and so on. A reminder that politics has never not been reprehensible. As well as drawing the state's ire, it draws the ire of the Chicago Police Department, who blank McNeil and attempt to stymie his investigation, rather than, say, making sure they actually did a good job as police. Isn't it funny how the more corrupt, inept, or systematically racist a police force is, the more likely it is to be described as the greatest police force in the country stroke world stroke universe by its members in a film? Witness the Chicago PD here, the LAPD in the 1940s and 50s, think LA Confidential, and the NYPD in every film ever. After trying several avenues, having Frank Vicek undergo a lie detector test, administered interestingly in the film by Leonard Keeler, the actual inventor of the device, who apparently didn't trust any actor to correctly operate the machine, a search through the Polish immigrant neighbourhoods of the city to find Wanda Skutnik and get her to refute her testimony, failing that to try to invalidate it and question her character. But McNeil is at a loss, and the paper is being pressured to drop the story. Eventually McNeil manages to secure an all-or-nothing review of Vicek's case at the State Parole Board. Partly noir, though both journalist and defendant are really too upright and of good character for that genre. Partly documentarian, Truman Bradley's narration brings to mind newsreel footage. Call Northside 777 is a thoroughly entertaining ride, that perhaps only suffers nowadays from being a little familiar in structure and payoff, though was undoubtedly considerably fresher when released in 1948. Unsurprisingly, the film's biggest draw is Jimmy Stewart, notably dispensing with much of his more charming attributes to portray a tough and cynical reporter, but one whose conscience clearly nags at him, and who finds a fire lit inside when he becomes convinced of a miscarriage of justice. A fire further fueled by his indignation that those who should be invested in righting this wrong are resolutely uninterested in doing so. Conte paints a sympathetic and compelling character as the man done wrong, particularly when the truth of his divorce is discovered, and it is impossible not to be won over by Kasia Orsazewski as Frank's loving mother Tilly. Though some of the more minor characters are pretty standard, there are no wrong notes, save perhaps the almost cartoonish boyfriend of Wanda Skutnik, and Lee Jacobs' editor, who spends much of the film seemingly wryly amused. But I suppose he does provide something of a foil to the rather serious protagonist, so maybe that flies. It's a crisply shot piece, with the real Chicago locations looking great, though it undoubtedly becomes most visually interesting when it adopts a look more fitting of a film noir, particularly in the building where McNeil first meets Tilly, and during his search for Wanda Skutnik in the areas behind the docks. Story-wise it is compelling, as I mentioned earlier, and the only caveats that I have are that the tense finale is undoubtedly less so nowadays as it feels particularly well worn, and that, based on a true story as it may be, it's one of the earliest examples I can recall of the great Hollywood salvation by technology trope, and absolutely the earliest of the magical improvement of image quality. The crucial revelation, whether or not the date in a newspaper seen in a photograph proves police malfeasance, is undermined by the last-minute transition, at the greatest level of magnification, from illegible blurriness to crystal clarity. Every time that I watch this film, I keep imagining Jimmy Stewart yelling "Enhance" at the fax machine. Further proof that there's nothing new under the sun, especially in Hollywood. But don't let you put that off, I definitely recommend this one.
Yeah, so it's difficult to make watching something getting printed out over a wire service to be particularly tension filled as well. And I suppose that bit at the ending, I didn't quite see how that one photograph of that one date necessarily proved that he was innocent. It proved parts of a testimony was false, but it didn't seem like it was a magic bullet. But c'est la vie.
Apparently in the real life case, that wasn't a little surprise. Just got that the film didn't necessarily follow the real life case.
Oh my god.
Yes, Chokaruni. No, it's the real life case. Vanda Skutnik, or the real life analogue of Skutnik, her testimony was thrown out because it was eventually proven that she had originally told the police that she was unable to identify
Right.
the two guys, and then that she was largely coerced into testifying afterwards.
Which makes rather more sense, yes.
Yes, in this, it raises doubt, and I can see why it sets up enough doubt there that something was a bit dodgy, and certainly due procedure wasn't followed. So, at the very least, I can understand it would be grounds for a retrial, and it's not like the magic bullet thing that the film presents it as being.
Yeah. Yes. Would you say it's one of the few instances where it does have a voiceover that doesn't actually hinder the film, as the Drew Tamdale protocol would normally?
Weirdly, that actually makes two films in this podcast where I will say that's actually the case. Maybe not as much in this one, but I think because it's only used in a couple of places, but it suits this almost newsreel-like portions of parts of it. Don't know whether the film would necessarily suffer for not having it, but I don't think it suffers for having it, certainly, which is a relatively rare thing. I think you call it the Drew Tamdale protocol there, but I think we're largely on the same page there in thinking that voiceovers are generally pretty unnecessary.
Most of the time, true. I don't really have an awful lot negative to say about Call Northside 777. I enjoyed it an awful lot. I hadn't seen it until there. Its theatrical release poster is terrible, so it's got that not going for it. Yeah, I enjoyed it an awful lot. I mean, I didn't actually make any connection between this and film noir until I started reading the Wikipedia entry on it. You mentioned it there. It doesn't seem noirish at all to me. Like you say, that there's a couple of scenes where there are some shadows, but that seemed to be about the extent of it. But yeah, the film I enjoyed wholeheartedly. Very interesting narrative to go through, and of course it's James Stewart. What sort of animal wouldn't like James Stewart in a film? So yeah, I found an awful lot to like in it. Yeah, bombs along quickly enough, doesn't outstay its welcome, keeps the revelations going quite well. Stewart, as you say, playing a little bit against type, I suppose, and all the more interesting performance from it. And yeah, the Chicago locations look great. Yeah, it's just a nice little story of someone's determination to get to the bottom of something, and works out quite well for everyone. So yes, I enjoyed it an awful lot.
It's nice to, obviously, particularly in this podcast, when you see a journalist in film, they're more likely to be the hero, whereas in real life, it very often find that you're thinking of a journalist as a rather sleazy, unpleasant person, but he is a compelling hero in this, and it's like using his journalistic skills and actual research to find out the truth of a thing. I always find that a very satisfying style of film.
Yeah, there's a very real distance between this and Nightcrawler or something like that.
Yes. Nightcrawler, excellent film, but yes, very, very different style of journalism. I'm not really sure you could call Nightcrawler journalism.
No.
I'm pretty sure it's called crime, but okay then, so we're going to go to what is undoubtedly the most well-known film we're going to cover tonight, and which also happens to cover one of the most well-known crimes of the 20th century. Mr. Morse, would you like to tell us about All the President's Men?
Yes, All the President's Men. Of all the films we're going to cover today, this was the one I looked forward to most, as I've somehow contrived not to see it so far. And it's supposed to be, of course, an exemplar of the genre. In the unlikely event you've not heard of it, Alan J. Pakula's 1976 film sees Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford take up the mantle of Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward as the Washington Post reporters responsible for every news story these days having the word "gate" suffixed to it. New to the paper, Woodward is assigned to cover the seemingly minor incident of the red-handed capture of some goons at a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex, but his interest is piqued by the surprisingly expensive lawyer representing supposedly low-rent clientele and their claims of ties to the CIA. Tugging on the strings of this seems to connect increasingly higher-profile members of the Republican Party machine, with the more experienced Bernstein also getting assigned to the growing story. They gain the help of high-placed anonymous source, codenamed Deep Throat, played by Hal Holbrook, which very much gave me X-Files flashbacks. But the reliance on such mysterious sources spooks the Post's senior editors, who want more legitimate sources on record. And this, as much as following the story, taxes the duo's determination and ingenuity. There's little value in recounting all the uncovered cover-ups that eventually led to Nixon resigning in disgrace, and indeed the film sensibly breaks off its pursuit and cuts to the chase itself, presumably having felt that it had fulfilled its remit of showing the procedural side of things and the character of those reporting on it. Now, I don't think I have a great deal negative to say about the film. Hoffman and Redford aren't my favourite actors, but there's little to complain about with their performances. It moves along quickly enough given the era it's from, and it's a solid look at the technicalities of reliably investigating and reporting an unarguably important story. Undeniably an important lesson in this time of erroneous tweets immediately becoming headline news. Yet, I don't know, All the President's Men just didn't click with me. Which is not to say I disliked it, really, but it just didn't make any lasting impact on me, which I can't rightly explain, as I enjoyed the very similar approach that Spotlight took, which clearly owes a massive debt to this film, but All the President's Men just couldn't hold my attention. Perhaps I should have been watching the animated adaptation, All the President's Hens. As a side note, Bakula should be commended for his dedication to office space veracity, making replicas of old phone books and purchasing the exact same desks and the exact same shade of paint that Washington office had at the time, at a fairly reasonable expense for his backlot set, although one does have to ask the question, who on earth cares about that?
That's like method set dressing, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely insane. Again, there is no obvious reason for me not to recommend this film, although, to be honest, I didn't really enjoy it, but I think I may have to mark that up as mental distress from the tail end of my illness. I was not in the best frame of mind for watching it, but yes, one of those cases that comes up now and again where it's like, I see nothing wrong with this film except it just kind of bounced off me. So I will give it another look in when I'm feeling a bit more receptive to its wiles and see where it goes. Because yes, as I say, I don't really have any negatives against it.
This is a film that I also had managed to avoid seeing. Not willfully, more that I've been aware of the film for so long and
yeah, when you kind of
pretty
know,
solid understanding of what happened in it, that I almost felt like I didn't need to watch it.
Yeah, when you know what's going to happen, and it doesn't seem like it's really going to be necessary to view it. Yeah,
and I really did enjoy it. Likewise, I don't find Robert Redford or Dustin Hoffman particularly engaging in most things. There are exceptions, but they're certainly far from my favourite actors, and so maybe that's a bit of a problem. But yeah, I still very much enjoyed it, and I thoroughly enjoy the genuine investigation that it shows, and that it's to do with hard work and dedication and things like that, and not just magic luck.
Yeah.
Or into that. And it's a film I've mentioned a few times, I think, on Fuzz and Film, but it's one of the reasons I so very much like things like The Day of the Jackal, when Michael Lonsdale's investigation is about, just donkey work a lot of the time and doing the hard work in the investigation and not relying on some miraculous piece of evidence at the end or some eureka moment that the main character has a couple of minutes before the end of the film. And I really find that sort of approach and that sort of story very, very satisfying. So I very much enjoyed All the President's Men for that. I just don't quite see what the big deal is about it, though. It's an absolutely solid film. I did enjoy it, and I would certainly recommend it. But as it's been sort of held up as the great journalism film, as it so often is, that's my impression of it anyway. It's like, really? It's a good film, but it's not the greatest of films. And I actually liked it a lot more 5 minutes before the end than I did right at the end, because I was really enjoying the hard work they were doing, and they were trying to catch the people out. And then I learned from this, assuming that it's accurate, I never really realised before that the whole Watergate thing, it took a long time before anybody paid any real attention to that. It was a very minor story at best for a long time. And then they do all that work and they start catching stuff, and then they just decide to stop before the really interesting thing of catching the United States president in a lie. Yeah. It's like I found that tremendously frustrating. It's like, we're just going to stop now and we're just going to we'll finish the investigation with a couple of lines of text at the end of the film, and I was
Yes.
screaming at that point, like, no, you can't do that. You can't just do all this hard work and then leave the bit where they catch the president, the main guy, the top guy, where it leads to his downfall by, yes, and later Nixon was impeached. No, I want to see how that led to that. That's the most interesting part. So if you're going to have the investigation, maybe show a bit at the beginning, then skip over the middle and get to the end, because the end's the juicy part.
Yeah.
To be honest, that bit, that infuriated me. Otherwise, yeah, very good film. I just don't quite see what the fuss is about.
Well, it's good to know that I'm not entirely mental for thinking more or less the same. Yeah, it is a strange ending, isn't it? It's very much. It's not even skipping to the end. It's giving the end in an epilogue, which is a bit disappointing.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's a strange choice. Strange choice. Still worth watching, but I wouldn't make it high priority or anything.
Yeah.
It does not live up to its reputation. Okay, let's move on. I think that it would be fair to say that, back in 2003, no one, including myself and Scott, who I believe I saw this with, would have been tremendously enthusiastic or optimistic about seeing a film starring Hayden Christensen, who, to most of the world at that point, was best known as that guy largely failing to do a passable impression of a comatose tree in Star Wars Episode 2 The Attack of the Clowns. Though, to be fair, he did a pretty decent attempt at irritating, petulant, whiny brat, trapped in the body of a tree, assuming that was how George Lucas wrote that character. I can't fit the appropriate number of quotation marks around the word wrote, or anything to do with George Lucas, or would be here all day. But in his defence, most of the actors involved in that farcically bad effects showcase were so wooden that I'm surprised that the Wookiees weren't constructing their dwellings around them. Still, it did make Christensen as a young journalist and writer-director Billy Ray's Shattered Glass a difficult sell, as the film very much had to excuse Star Wars rather than cash in on it. Fortunately, it was a stumbling block worth overcoming. Ol Anakin plays Stephen Glass, a hotshot writer for New York City-based political magazine The New Republic, which had a vibrant staff of writers mostly in their mid to early 20s. Oh, and as a quick aside, the film does begin with an information card saying that the median age of the, or is it the mean age? Certainly some type of average. The average age of the writers at the New Republic at the time was 26, which they had to add because test audiences didn't believe that the staff could possibly be so young. Glass is painted as the shining star amongst them, kind, helpful, willing to help others while writing his own entertaining, colourful stories. Though loved and even revered by most of his colleagues, he seems to get under the skin of Peter Sarsgaard's Chuck Lane. When Lane unexpectedly replaces Hank Azaria's Michael Kelly as editor and finds himself required to investigate the veracity of some of Glass's stories, colleagues rally around, and all assume that Lane is, and always has been, jealous of Glass's popularity and skill. It's a not unreasonable assumption. Lane isn't particularly popular in the office, and certainly doesn't receive the love and adoration that his predecessor did, an editor who was seen as being protective and fatherly towards his staff. His pieces, while no doubt well researched, don't seem to have the zing and personality of Glass's work. But the problem is, it's not sour grapes. Turns out, Glass is a bullshit artist extraordinaire. The problems begin under Kelly's editorship, when the chairman of the American Conservative Union questions the veracity of Glass's story on the drunken antics of attendees at a Young Republicans convention. When Kelly confronts him, we can almost see the wheels frantically turning behind Stephen's eyes as he tries to explain away the lie he's just been caught in. He concocts another lie, and cops to a singular error, which is enough to mollify Kelly and have him back Glass's article. Soon after Chuck Lane takes over though, Adam Penneberg, Steve Zahn, a reporter for the then fledgling website Forbes Digital Tool, begins investigating Glass's vivid tale of a Californian tech company hiring a 15-year-old hacker as it was more efficient than fighting him. Penneberg contacts the New Republic when he is unable to corroborate any of the details, and Lane begins to conduct his own investigation. Quickly, Glass's story, and Glass himself, begins to unravel, and it is discovered that Glass concocted the story from whole cloth. So false is it that one of the only pieces of fact in the article is that there is a state in Union named California, though even that may cause doubt after so many other lies. Glass is fired, and all of his other stories for the magazine investigated. Of 41 pieces published, 27 of them were wholly or partly fabricated. The magazine arranges to publish corrections and apologies before Glass's breathtaking and audacious mendacity brings the whole publication tumbling down. It's a really quite compelling story, and it's particularly fascinating to watch the wheels turn as Glass is forced to create lie after lie to cover all of the untruths that have been discovered, and see his increasingly desperate attempts not to be found out, including faking the website of a tech firm on, of all places, an AOL member page.
Hmm.
It bombs along, and tells its fairly dense tale efficiently and effectively in a brisk 94 minutes. It does suffer from an unnecessary framing device, Glass visiting his old school and giving a possibly imagined talk to the pupils there,
Yeah.
which adds nothing of value, though in a genuine verity, and this is what I alluded to earlier, there are moments of Glass's voiceover that actually add to the telling, notably his description of the rigorous fact-checking that the New Republic articles went through, and how that can be circumvented. Something no doubt made easier when you were head of fact-checking, as Glass was at the time. Perhaps the most notable thing about Shattered Glass, outside of the spectacular amount of lying, is just how not only not bad Hayden Christensen is, but how good he actually is.
Yeah.
While he's clearly out of his element, not in a kid who's just wandered into the middle of a movie kind of way, but in that he's constantly bumping up against the limit of his ability when all around him take their roles in their stride. Christensen is a superb example of the difference that a director that actually cares about acting, coupled with dialogue that an actual human might speak, can make to an actor's performance. It would be very easy to paint Stephen Glass as contemptible lying bastard, but here Christensen portrays the young writer surprisingly sympathetically, with the overriding sense being that Glass was foolish, eager to please, and seeking of approval and attention, rather than simply being deceitful and mendacious in order to further his career. Though the film does suggest that lying is a habit that he finds particularly hard to break. It doesn't excuse him, and only Glass and his colleagues know how close to the truth it is, but it's rather more interesting than making him a straight-up villain. There's strong support from Azaria as the mentor figure, and Steve Zahn as just the right side of scoffingly cynical rival reporter. But it's Sarsgaard that anchors the film, and he does a fine job in his role as the editor who wants to support and believe his employee, but whose ethical and journalistic standards will not allow him to do so unquestioningly. Alas, the women, most prominently Chloe Sevigny and Rosario Dawson, fare less well, and as usual it's the too old story of lack of material, not inadequate performance. Far from perfect perhaps, Shattered Glass is a thoroughly entertaining drama, and a sadly necessary reminder to modern media not to be so credulous, especially when too many report or repeat stories published on just one website. If a respected publication with a dedicated fact-checking process and a department can be so thoroughly duped, those lazy, gullible, feckless morons that we have nowadays have to do a lot better, and go an awful lot further in their attribution than was on Twitter. Sadly relevant.
Yeah, this was the first I had thought about it really since 2003, I guess, when we watched it in the first instance. And I liked it then, and I like it now. Echo a lot of what you're saying to the point that I won't go into it too much, but yes, Christensen does much better than you would expect, given what he had been done, what he'd been best known for before then. Yes, he's perfectly adequate in this role. He actually does quite a good performance. You kind of get that, you say, that kind of just searching for approval, for acceptance, to try and get that. It comes across quite well, and he does manage to get that across the kind of slightly panicked, let's start cascading lies at this point thing when he's questioned. That comes across quite well, and it does a pretty convincing job of that. And I very much like Skarsgård in this as well. He's kind of quietly one of my favourite actors. He never seems to get like huge roles in a lot of things, but anytime he's deployed into something, he's invariably very effective in it.
Yeah, even when you don't see him on screen, like voicing the robot and Robot and Frank.
Yeah. Yes, this is quite an entertaining story. It's good to see the polar opposite of what happened in All the President's Men. This is how you can get away with basically making all this up just by a quirk of the fact checking process, and it's kind of never explained. And sometimes wish he'd kind of gone into that. Is how much was he aware of that earlier in his career? Like, did he sort of gradually discover this, or was it just something that kind of came all at once? And he decided that he could just essentially start making things up. It's a bit easier than actually going out to find the real story.
Yeah, it may be interesting to have seen, like, maybe there was the one point where he crossed over the line.
Mm-hmm.
That at one point he was maybe desperate for a deadline and he was under pressure and he was very, very young and I can't quite finish the story, I'll make it up. And then found himself gradually crossing that line to the point the line disappeared or something, perhaps. I don't know.
What also occurred to me, and I don't know, I've not actually read anything he's done. I know he did write the book after this, but clearly he's someone who wants to tell stories. So you kind of wonder why he went into the journalism aspect of things rather than just becoming a novelist in the first instance. Maybe just better lucrative. And it's never really addressed at any point as like, was that a driving factor in what he was doing? Was this ever something that he was wanting to be into as a younger person? Did he come to journalism as a kind of backdoor entry kind of thing? Or, these kind of things. There's a few questions about his character that I think would have been nice to get to the bottom of. I guess Glass himself was not particularly keen on divulging it. Puzzling to think that he's now going on to try and become a lawyer with this sort of reputation behind him.
Fortunately, though, he hasn't. It was the film.
Pass the bar because everyone's went, well, obviously not.
Yes. The film ends with a card saying that he had gone to Georgetown Law School and got a law degree, I think. But he's now working as a paralegal because, yes, in 2 different states, he was not allowed to pass the bar, to join the bar because of ethical concerns. So it's nice to know some legal boards somewhere have ethical standards.
Yeah. Good to see Steve Zahn again. He's someone who seems to have very much kind of gone off the radar recently.
Yeah, and somebody you normally associate with more comic roles, but he actually does a pretty good job in this.
Yeah. Again, fairly minor role, but yeah, it's a bit of a sausage fest. Could have done with some more than 2 lines for the female characters would have been nice. The rest of this, I enjoyed an awful lot. Yeah, as I say, nice little story. It's well told, quite well contained. It doesn't go to places that it doesn't need to, I guess, in a lot of respects. It's very efficiently told, and yes, I heartily enjoyed it. Well worth giving a look at. Wasn't a huge success at the time, so it's possibly gone under a lot of people's radar. So yeah, if that's the case, seek this one out and give it a go, and you shall be rewarded.
Yes, and really don't let his performance in Star Wars films put you off. That is would kind of be unfair on him, actually. He's stretched to his limits in this, but because he's actually getting a chance to act as opposed to being a clothes horse, basically. An angry clothes horse with a big shiny thing in his hand in the Star Wars films.
Ooh.
And moving on. Right then, Scott. The tobacco industry. They've never done anything bad worth investigating, right?
Not a thing. Upright, upstanding citizens, all of them. So we are, of course, talking about The Insider, which was a Michael Mann film. Michael Mann not being the type to rush into production, so there was a 4-year gap between 1999's The Insider and the offloaded Heat, discussed in podcast Passum. The Insider carries over Al Pacino in the lead role, playing Lowell Bergman, a producer for respected American investigative journalism TV show 60 Minutes. His interest is piqued when a box of documents is delivered to him, alleging that tobacco companies were secretly coming up with ways of making their death sticks more addictive, while swearing blind that they knew nothing of any such activities, or that nicotine was addictive, or what a nicotine was, or that the grass was green, or that the Pope defecates in the woods. The documentation comes from the recently fired head researcher Jeffrey Wigand, played by Russell Crowe, everyone's favourite Antipodean phone tosser. He refused to go along with a plan to put another dangerous additive into the company's cigarettes and was fired under the barely defensible reason of poor communication skills as a result. The film is, then, a 2.5-hour chronicle of Wigand struggling to balance his desire to expose these practices and the extraordinary extents that his former company go to keep him silent. This ranges from mildly threatening meetings reminding him of his confidentiality agreement to alleged death threats, and finally commissioning a report smearing his name as it comes closer to the 60-minute piece's air date. Meanwhile, Bergman is fighting his own battle to get the piece on the air, with the corporate lawyers expressing grave concerns about the possible liabilities that this could open up for them, unwanted at the best of times, but in particular ahead of a takeover bid. And it's not like Big Tobacco doesn't have lawyers with hair triggers. Both these struggles result in trials, tribulations, and personal costs for both men, although Wiggin clearly grasps a significantly more turd-covered stick than Bergman. There's perhaps a danger of The Insider being passed over, as evidenced by the disappointing returns at the box office, because what you'd be forgiven for taking as the central conceit of the film, Big Tobacco being big arseholes, isn't really news to anyone. But that's a mistake, as this could be about any subject, even as disgusting as this one is, but it's more about the dilemmas involved when doing the right thing is going to come at a terrible cost. The film lives and dies by its central performances, and that of Crowe in particular, who delivers perhaps his best turn to date. It's pretty high up my list of Pacino performances too, and meanwhile a supporting cast running the gamut from Michael Gambon and Rip Torn to Christopher Plummer means that even some very minor roles get major performances. The narrative is solid enough, but this is a character piece at heart, and Crowe does a terrific job of wringing the emotion from the role. If this isn't Michael Mann's best film, it's certainly challenging for it, packed with much more tension than you'd expect from the subject matter, with some meaty ethical conundrums to conundrum, all doused in Mann's slickness. I can't really come up with much in the way of criticism for it. I feel perhaps it ought to be half an hour shorter, but I can't point to anything that I'd actually want to cut out. Maybe if you're not interested in the story, it may seem a tad dry. Maybe you've gone off Russell Crowe thanks to his extracurricular activities, although not to minimise his occasional anger issues, he's hardly Harvey Weinstein. But in general, I can't come up with any reasons not to recommend this film to everyone in the event that you have not seen it.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you think maybe it's the best Michael Mann film, and I'm thinking I probably am in agreement. I mean, I like Heat, but certainly nothing as much as, for instance, Craig likes Heat, although more than you do, clearly. People keep scoffing me for saying that I like Collateral a lot, which I don't understand, because I like Collateral a lot, but Manhunter's good. I remember so little of Last of the Mohicans that possibly that's better, but I can't remember, really can't remember it. But of the other Michael Mann films I can think of, I suspect The Insider probably is my favourite film of his. And certainly a great deal of that is to do with the excellent central performances he's brought out. Yeah. You mentioned the supporting cast who are great. Christopher Plummer in particular is, I always forget which one he is, Dan Rather, or the other guy, Mike Wallace, isn't he? Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes. Yeah, he's fantastic, but it's Pacino and Crowe. The only slight reservation I have with Crowe is that at times I don't know, I think maybe it's a personality thing rather than his performance, that I wasn't necessarily buying him on occasion as this great scientist.
Yeah.
That's pretty minor, it's only fleeting though. And Al Pacino, who in this is some sort of weirdly restrained 0.3 of a Scarface, which is possibly the only other time I've seen Pacino quite so restrained. I think it is Insomnia.
Yeah. But
yeah, Pacino's great as this fantastically principled and passionate central character who really does care about his sources, who is incredibly strongly principled, who is moral and crusading and just a fascinating character. But he's not like exactly some sort of untouchable bastion of virtue or anything. He feels like a real person. He's kind of warm and cares about the people who are risking their own careers or in some cases lives to help him put this story in the air, which is, as much as we'd like to think definitely a lot of these journalistic television programs are there as entertainment.
Yeah.
And yeah, so him and Crowe together, fantastic. Superb performances from everybody else. A lot of Michael Mann's films are actually quite long, but of them, I think this is possibly the one I would least want to take anything out of. For me, I think it's just a nice length because the story grips me every time. And I don't really have anything negative to say about it. Certainly there are people in it I don't like, but they're meant to be unlikable.
Yeah.
Gina Gerson and Stephen Tobolowsky in particular is kind of somewhat odious corporate lackeys, for want of a better term. Yeah, it's all around it. It's a thoroughly entertaining film.
Yes, indeed.
The Insider is a good one. Watch it.
Yes. Another arguable box office failure. It certainly didn't pull the numbers that I guess the bean counters were expecting, although it's hardly an obscure film by anyone's stretch of imagination. But yes, if you've not seen it, again, definitely stick this one on your list.
I was going to mention this at the end. I mean, I normally don't do recommendations so much. We just tend to talk about, in terms of like separate to the films we've actually covered on the podcast. But I have already made a couple at the start of the episode, and I found that there were so many films that I wanted to talk about this podcast and couldn't fit them all in. One I really wanted to mention, I think I was going to leave at the end. I think now's the appropriate time because it covers television, and it's the same network, it's CBS, who for a long time, and I have no idea whether it's still the case now, but television journalism basically doesn't seem to exist anymore, so I suspect not. But CBS had such a fantastic reputation for journalistic integrity for a long, long time. And if you have any interest in that at all, and you haven't already seen it, watch Good Night and Good Luck, which features an earlier CBS anchor called Edward R. Murrow. We know we've covered it before in our modern day black and white podcast, but I just think it's a fantastic film, and I would urge you to watch that in addition to The Insider. They seem to work together quite well.
Reiterated.
So, we're going to take a step back in time now and across the Atlantic. Sostiene Pereira, variously known in English as According to Pereira, Pereira Maintains, and Pereira Declares, from the Italian original, sees Marcello Mastroianni as Pereira, a writer for independent Lisbon newspaper Lisboa, simply Lisbon in English, during the time of the fascist Estado Novo dictatorship in Portugal and the civil war in neighbouring Spain. While once a news reporter, the widowed and solitary Pereira now writes and edits the newspaper's culture section, and seems content to live in the past, sheltered from the political turmoil that surrounds him on the Iberian Peninsula and in Europe as a whole. Instead, he makes considerable effort to contribute to his poor health, with quality cigars and pancreas-assaulting, tooth-dissolving quantities of sugar added to his lemonade. See, there's so much lemonade I think I got diabetes just by watching this. All the while chatting to his dead wife's photograph. His priorities change, however, when he hires a passionate and political young man to help him prepare obituaries of literary figures. This man, Montero, Stefano Dionisse, professes at first to be apolitical and not actually interested in obituaries, instead more interested in life than in death. Still, Pereira offers Montero the job, but much to his chagrin, his obituaries are politically loaded. Pereira learns that the impetus behind this actually comes from Montero's girlfriend Marta, Nicoleta Braschi, and further learns that the couple are involved in the anti-fascist struggle in Portugal, and also in recruitment of fighters for the Republican army over the border in Spain. Being involved with this fiery and determined couple, who are willing to put their own lives at risk to oppose fascism, creates a new spark of life in Pereira and encourages him, even in a small way, to join the fight and use his position as a journalist to do some good, and open the eyes of the public to what is happening. Mastroianni spent a large chunk of time towards the end of his career trying to throw off his reputation as a screen playboy and heartthrob, epithets he'd never cared for personally, and created several fantastic portraits of older men in his final years. One such is Pereira, and he's a delight as the quirky, detached from the here and now, but smart still, newspaperman, who, far from being described as any sort of Latin lover, could best be described as avuncular. In reality, the story is fairly slight, and Pereira himself plays only a small part in the political strife that is going on in the background, but it's a charming story with a glint of sharp steel under the surface, and his journey from detachment to heart of the action is rewarding, and, perhaps because he begins so far away from politics, quite shocking, particularly when he experiences firsthand the cost of defying the authorities. Mastroianni is given fine support by Dionisi and Baraschi as the idealistic young couple, as well as Lisbon native Joaquim de Almeida as the local waiter who feeds Pereira much of his local news. French actor Daniel Otoya as the idiosyncratic doctor who is happy for Pereira to postpone his diet as long as he can share one of his fine cigars, and Swiss Marta Keller as the Jewish woman who encourages Pereira to use his position as a journalist to make a difference. This is set in Portugal, but it's an Italian film, and I mention the various nationalities to highlight their skill at acting in Italian, and to create an opportunity to carp about the piss-poor quality of foreign language education in this country, especially when we were at school. And yes, I know that this has sod all to do with Sostiene Pereira, but when has that ever stopped me before? And it's probably something which warrants some good journalistic think pieces. So there you go. There's your incredibly tenuous connection to today's theme. Visually, it's not particularly exciting, but it does have a very particular look. Despite being filmed largely on location in and around Lisbon, its sets and colour process give it a very warm palette that actually makes much of it feel very soundstagey, but on the flip side it does fit and evoke its 1930s setting. I didn't really bring my notes to a satisfactory conclusion at the end there. That's your lot.
Yes, another unexpected little gem in this. I enjoyed this wholeheartedly. It's probably something I don't think I'd ever go back to again. I don't think I'm going to get anything more out of this on repeat viewing. But
No,
it's
that's fair.
it's a solid little story, and it's amazingly charming. In particular, Pereira himself, Marcello Mastroianni. If there was anyone, well, if that role hadn't been cast properly, the film would be unwatchable.
Yeah, it hinges so much on that character being played just right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And it's absolutely nailed. So that's a good thing. Just an incredibly charming character to sort of hinge a relatively slight, as you say, narrative around, but it works. Some of his support's good, some of it's not. I didn't think Stefano Dionisi did particularly well as the kid. He seemed a bit flighty. I'm not entirely sure I bought his character, but it didn't really detract from the enjoyment of the piece itself. So, such is life. Looks really nice. I like the way it looked. I like the setting and such. Like it. Just again a bit of a break from the norm.
Well, so I was just going to, in regards to the setting too. I said it did sound kind of soundstagey, but it did just feel right for like warm Mediterranean evening in the 1930s.
Yeah.
It really evoked that era. I thought.
Yes, and but very enjoyable. Touches on some darker social themes that were going on at the time without ever really making it the focus of it. It is more about the journalist than the events that are going on, and it's none the worse for it. Yes, a terrifically enjoyable one. I now wish I'd paid a little bit more attention to the music because I'm seeing it as an Ennio Morricone score.
Morricone, yes, always a good thing.
Yes, but got to say it didn't really stick in my mind as being memorable one way or the other, but that's maybe one thing I might go and listen to again. But even minor Morricone is better than most other scores, so yes, another reason to stick it on your list, and yes, it definitely deserves to be there. Give this one a go too.
So yeah, I just mentioned too that I've been to Lisbon. I know that it's nowhere near the Mediterranean, it's on the Atlantic. I was just talking about Mediterranean lifestyles and settings which you think of when you think of Iberia, okay? Or anybody writes in to correct me and say, there's nowhere near the Mediterranean.
Yeah, nerds.
This is a film I had never heard of before.
Likewise, yeah.
There's some of these films, it's a case of just looking at large lists of recommended films about journalism or journalists, and this one kind of stuck out to me, largely because I was looking for something not in the English language to begin with, and the idea of the story appealed to me and the idea of the setting, and seeing, because we'd skipped over La Dolce Vita with the same actor, but seeing Mastroianni as the older character sounded actually quite intriguing. And I'm really rather pleased that of all the films we could have picked, to pick this one. Yeah, as you say, not a massive amount of rewatch value, I suspect, but definitely it's worth watching the once. It's a really interesting film.
Yes.
So though, we come to the final film of the podcast, which I refused to do the introduction for because I have no idea what was going on in it. So Scott's going to tell me there, aren't you, Scott?
Yes, the film we are talking about is variously known, but Entranced Earth is the one what I've got. If I recall correctly, it made the list off the back of something like the IMDb summary, which runs roughly thus. In the hypothetical Latin American country of El Dorado, poet and journalist Paulo Martins fights against the populist governor Felipe Vieira, and the conservative president Porfirio Diaz, which, to be fair, if you're going to try to boil down Terra em Trance, Brazilian writer-director Glauber Rocha's 1967 film down to a paragraph, is about as close as you're going to get. But it does rather sell short the outright weirdness of the film, though, and I'm rather sure that's why this film's Wikipedia page, so often the home of the needlessly detailed recap, doesn't even bother in this instance.
It's like, this is a film that exists and this is its name. Bye now.
Yes. It would probably be foolish of me to even attempt to recap the plot, but no one's ever accused me of good sense. To be honest, though, it's tough to add a great deal more about it. Yardel Filo's Paulo Martins is a poet first and journalist a very distant second. If I'm reading it rightly, it's framed non-linearly, with him reminiscing, sort of, with his girlfriend Sarah, Glauci Roca, while driving away very quickly from the hot mess El Dorado has found itself in, assault rifle in hand, lamenting his part in the hot messification, along with pretty much everything else in his life. We flash back to Paulo's more idealistic days as he convinced Jose Lugoi's Felipe Vieira to run for governor's office on what appears to be a left-wing socialist ticket, railing against the elite, but this soon descends into populism, with Vieira making a string of promises he couldn't hope to meet, to the adulation of the masses who desperately want to believe him. We also see his relationship with hardcore capitalist rich boy President Porfirio Diaz, who stands for all the things you expect, and worries that the external business investment will drop off after Vieira's election, and plots to overthrow him by arms if necessary, although budget constraints rather limits the opportunity for on-screen civil war. Paulo is, in truth, little more than an observer in these events, and aside from decrying them, he has little role in attempting to stop them. And what events they are, as before long both sides are pushed out to ludicrous extents, with Vieira almost assumed by a wave of the worst sort of mob rule, and Diaz playing out some sort of Wolf of Wall Street style playboy excesses, before ending up giving what's possibly some sort of party political broadcast as a frothing, ranting fascist. I'm perhaps underplaying the oddity of the film.
You're definitely underplaying the oddity of the film,
Yes.
Scott. You haven't once mentioned the ermine cloak and the massive crown, or the messianic Christ-like scene.
Yeah. What with Paulo being a poet and all, outbreaks of poetry presented as dialogue are frequent and, well, melodramatic isn't the right term, but it's as close as one I can come to. In that regard, it's rather like a musical without the backing track. It's a wildly baffling piece to watch when entering blind, and while I can't say I enjoyed it in any traditional sense, it is fascinating.
Oh yeah, that's true. It's not conventionally bad at the very least.
Having done a little digging, I can at least make some sense of the context. Roca was a leading force behind Brazil's Cinema Novo, a movement very much in response to the French New Wave, and indeed the closest examples I can think of to liken this to would be some sort of cross between this year's Neruda and last year at Marienbad.
Yeah, it's clearly very, very influenced by the French New Wave. I thought that all the way through it. It really felt like it owed a debt to that.
Roca seemed to have a rather expansive and hopeful view of the influence that cinema could wield, way over and above simply highlighting injustices. It seems, along with his involvement in political causes, they thought to shepherd a cultural revolution. This rather hit the skids when Democratic President João Goulart was turfed out of office in a military coup, with noted asshole Castelo Branco assuming the dictatorship, bankrolled by the IMF and American multinationals. Not unlike the stated aims of Diaz for El Dorado, not at all coincidentally enough. Clearly, writer-director Roca was affected by this, and Paulo Martin's rage at, well, everyone, but particularly the politicians he feels betrayed by or disappointed in, must certainly be a bit of author insertion. So, with this in mind, it's possible to parse the film a little better, although ultimately I'm not sure it's more than a raging against the dying of the light, and Paulo's bellicose denunciations of everyone that isn't him can grow a touch tiring by the end of the piece. It's a howl of anguish more than it is a film, although it's all the more interesting for it. Now, we're not the kind of podcast that throws around the term Brechtian, but if we were, we'd be throwing it around right now. The editing, the deliberate desyncing of the sound, pacing, the one hopes deliberate overacting, some of the framing, certainly the refusal to establish any shot makes the film a dizzying mess, and as protagonists go, Paulo seems custom built to repel empathy. It has taken the art house style and turned it to all the art house, which would often have me running screaming, but Terra in Trance is just too peculiar a film to hate. At the risk of repeating myself, I can't hand on heart say that I enjoyed Terra in Trance, but it and the political and cultural milieu around it are absolutely fascinating and well worth reading about. Viewed in a vacuum, it's hard to take it seriously and hard to breathe, so don't view it in a vacuum. Or a Hoover, for that matter, although that's more of a hygiene concern. But looked at as part of the wider goings-on in Brazil at the time, it's a very interesting, inventive and outre mood piece, and a curiosity that's worth indulging. But yeah, it's mental.
Yes, it's mental. If you, by the time this comes out, maybe a couple of weeks ago, a week, if you look back in our Twitter feed, you'll see a GIF I've posted of one of the characters in this film, that is largely how I felt after watching this film.
Yeah.
Decidedly manic, slightly unhinged, not entirely sure what was going on. It's politically, it's interesting for the time, and you see that the Brazilian government tried to ban it because it was portraying Brazil in a negative light. All authoritarian regimes, they don't like to have anybody criticising them at all. Who does that sound like nowadays? Anyway, I did not like this film. I really, really did not like this film. But I don't regret watching it, I think, because it's been, there's nothing worse than mediocre. And this is not your conventionally bad film. This is your balls out super mental film, really. But yeah, so very clearly it was a great debt to the French New Wave. So I think if you like the French New Wave at all, it's definitely worth checking out and seeing how that was influencing other cinema in other parts of the world. Other than that, I absolutely could not recommend it because I think the number of people who will enjoy this film is fairly low.
Yeah, it is definitely not a general audience recommendation.
No.
This would clearly not be suited in your multiplex.
No, absolutely not. But it is, it's interesting. And I've seen, outside of some of the French New Wave films, as we've both mentioned, it's unlike anything I've seen. It's heavy into the imagery, as opposed to narrative or anything. As scenes, as I mentioned, the scenes of the right-wing character, although really, I suppose in the end they're both pretty right-wing, the two politicians, but the right-wing character, the big industrial man with these lots of money, wearing his big crown, but then at some point to try and show he was a humble person of the people, driving through, I think maybe some sort of very humble car like a Citroen 2CV or something like that, with a crucifix in his hand and wearing black. It's really, really heavy on the imagery. Maybe a bit too heavy at times. I guess it's trying to go for as much visual poetry as there is poetry in Paolo Martin's dialogue.
Yeah.
It is distinctive. I will give it that. It's about all I'm willing to give it, to be honest. I didn't enjoy the film, but I don't regret having seen it. So now I know what this film is like, and I can move on with my life. It's not something that will ever trouble my thoughts or my television screen again, I imagine. But
yeah. Again, it's difficult to recommend it in terms of being something that people will actually enjoy, I think. However, if you are the kind of person that does listen to film podcasts, you clearly got some interest in the genre. You're not just talking about, you're not just here for news about the latest Marvel films. So if you've got that level of investment in it and you've seen something like maybe Jodorowsky or something like that, and you've got a taste for that kind of thing, then that's probably more the end of the market that this is skewed towards. It is a very strange beat poetry section of a film more than it is anything that's comprehensible in any real sense.
And sort of, even like in terms of editing, it's almost like dream logic.
Yeah.
In parts, it's that sort of kind of fractured jumping from one scene to another, and it's. I think sort of real cinephiles just looking for something quite different might be encouraged to check this out.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but a big Marvel blockbuster, it is not.
If you want an easy time, this is not the one for you. It's not one to stick on when you're hungover in the morning or anything like that. But if you want something that's a bit more challenging, I think you will find this. I can't imagine anyone watching this and not finding it interesting. I can very much imagine them watching it and not enjoying it in the slightest, but they would have to admit that it is never boring.
Yes, absolutely not. It does not suffer the great crime of mediocrity.
Yes.
It is perhaps though a cautionary tale that just because you see the word you're looking for, in this case a journalist, in a synopsis of a film, does not mean that the film in fact has anything to do with that word at all, because, well, it doesn't. It really doesn't. And even though there are a number of scenes where you see Paolo in the newspaper office, presumably, and sitting at a typewriter, I don't think he ever actually uses that typewriter. It just seems to be a prop in front of him, and it's got nothing to do with journalism or newspapers at all. It's like, we only know he's a journalist because people say it a couple of times.
Yes. Judged purely in terms of it belonging as part of this podcast, it fails massively.
Of course, we couldn't have known that until we watched it. And certainly it was an interesting film to watch, but yes, there's the danger of relying on other people's rather inadequate synopses and plot keywords. Although, really, I think anybody who's ever used plot keywords on IMDb by now should know that to pay those no heed. The plot synopses, yes, right? Because often they're at least give you a fairly accurate idea of what's going on in the film. The plot keywords on IMDb are scattershot at best.
Yes.
So then, Scott, the Twitters.
Yes, before we go, a few bits of feedback on the Twitters. We asked for general thoughts on journalism films, these films that we were covering, and Blake Wrights at Blake Wrights on Twitter has, and just to mention that Blake is a host on the I'm the Host podcast, which I recommend heartily. And he says, All the President's Men has an interesting legacy, giving journalism a sense of purpose in the 70s. Though philosopher Slavoj Žižek argues it's a distraction, he argues movies like All the President's Men become a false catharsis or commiseration over corruption, luring the public away from effecting real change. But then he's also a bit of a troll, so who knows? I thought it was interesting to look at how journalists do their job, at least.
Yes, I very much agree with that last part. That it's what I like so much about it, is that almost procedural nature of it, of just seeing people working hard and using skill and education and things to do a job and not relying on magic, and it's not shortcutting away from what's actually the centre of their job.
Yeah.
I very much agree with that, but...
Yes. The earlier section, I have no expertise to judge. So, and next up, we asked a question on Twitter again more recently. Do you favour the investigation, as in the recent Spotlight, or the journalist, as in classics like La Dolce Vita or Foreign Correspondent? First off the blocks to answer that was our good friends at the Magic Lantern podcast, at lantern_cast. Always the investigation. Better when the villain or subject of investigation is compelling, at least more so than the investigator. The exception that comes to mind is television, when it's personality driven, and that's why you come back, a la Columbo or Kolchak.
I will echo what I said in reply to the Magic Lanterners, is I generally prefer the investigation as well, and they mentioned that the villain or subject investigation, that it's great when they're compelling, and I deliberately didn't pick Spotlight for this film because it is so recent, and it's more well known, I think, because of its being so recent, being award winning of late. But the villain in that is a corrupt, kiddie fiddling, protecting, hugely influential, incredibly rich, worldwide organisation that's existed for more than 1,000 years. That's a pretty compelling villain. So that's what makes something like Spotlight particularly appealing too.
Yes, and another answer from Blake Wrights. I think stories where the journal takes centre stage of the story makes more sense when their personality is the key, i.e. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Capote, etc. Yes, again, I guess agree with that. There's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is an incredible film that's got really almost nothing to do with journalism, isn't it? It's just the manicness of Hunter S. Thompson, and what a great film it is.
In that terms, that film is journalism is largely what paid for all the drugs. Yes. That's where journalism comes to that particular film. And also just asked in general about what films people liked about journalism, and Exploding Helicopter at Chopper Fireball mentioned The Sweet Smell of Success and Ace in the Hole are my two particular favourites.
Yes, another fine podcast. However, in this instance, two films I've never heard of. So I will stick them on a list and at least plan on trying to watch them, although I suspect it may never make it up the list. I'll certainly stick them on there and see what they're talking about. So that will wrap us up for today. What a day it's been. We've all had laughs. We've all recommended some good films. We've all been weirded out by Entranced Earth. So many great memories I think we've all made and shared today. If you want to talk to us about any of these events, these happenings, then please do so. A number of ways you could do so. You could go old school and put an email together to podcast@fudsonfilm.com, or you could be like the modern kids and use the Twitters and the Facebooks, whatever those are, at twitter.com or just at fudsonfilm or facebook.com/fudsonfilm, and we'll be delighted to talk to you. And you will be delighted by our response, I guarantee it. So we'll be back in 10 days, but until then, take care of yourself and each other. I've been Scott Morris, and the Root Avondale I'm as reliably insured as still Drew Avondale.
Hasta la próxima.